I'd like to welcome everybody to our 220th episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. My name is Benji Cohn, and I'm joined today by Eric, one of our forest health specialists, and we're going to be talking about spruce budworm in Minnesota's spruce and fir forest. This is an area in northern Minnesota that is near and dear to my heart. I love going up there and touring it, so I'm excited to learn a little bit more. Eric, I'll pass it off to you.
All right, thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about spruce budworm today. So it's one of our bigger forest health issues here in Minnesota, especially northeast Minnesota. Um, so let's get right into it. So the agenda, what I'll talk about today, I'll give a brief overview, uh, go into some of the biology, so the life cycle, how to identify this insect in the field, the damage it does, and what impact it's having on our forest here in Minnesota. And in addition to that, the role it's having with wildfire. I'll go over some brief management tactics and then close with some final thoughts. So just a quick overview here. Spruce budworm, it's eastern spruce budworm. There's actually two different species of budworm in North America. There's a western species in here in Minnesota, as well as the lake states, the northeast part of the country. It's eastern spruce budworm. And it's a native caterpillar. It's evolved with our forests for thousands of years. We've been documenting damage from eastern spruce budworm at least for the past 300 years. And that kind of might contradict what people might think, with the damage it does. Some people might think that this insect isn't native, with things like emerald ash borer that are causing a lot of devastation in parts of North America and Minnesota. But this species is native to Minnesota and North America. And it's probably the most destructive insect of spruce and fir forests in eastern North America. Again, that's the lake states, the northeast part of the country. And in addition to that, it's probably one of the more devastating forest insects in general in North America. This is a photo I took at Tennagooch State Park a couple of years ago, just showing some of the devastation it's done. You have kind of a mix of defoliation on balsam fir and white spruce trees. And if you've done any recreating, or if you live in northeast Minnesota, you've probably seen a lot of this damage and been having to deal with it. So the main host is spruce budworm. So it's called spruce budworm, but actually the preferred host is balsam fir. That's just due to how it synchronizes with the life cycle. In particular, when the buds start to open, that kind of lines up with the life cycle of this caterpillar. They also prefer to eat the needles of balsam fir more than spruce. That's just because the needles are easier to chew, they're softer throughout the growing season. And then this is also a main host, but maybe not the preferred host. It's still readily fed upon is white spruce. And they're a little more, they can withstand an outbreak better than balsam fir. That's just due to, as I mentioned, the needles tend to harden throughout the growing season. And then they also just produce more shoot material as compared to balsam fir. Other species that are fed upon that you can find here in Minnesota, black spruce, different pine species, in particular white pine, and then tamarack. So you would usually only see feeding damage on these species if they were nearby an area that had a high population of spruce budworm, or probably more commonly if they were mixed in those balsam fir spruce forests. So looking at how much balsam fir we have here in Minnesota. So this is a map from data from the Forest Service, so forest inventory analysis data. And so what we're looking at here, it's kind of like a heat map. This is the basal area of balsam fir in northeast Minnesota. So basal area is a commonly used forestry term. So it's the cross-sectional area of a tree 4.5 feet above the ground. Or more simply, it's just the measure of tree density on each acre of land. So you can see there's quite a bit of it in northeast Minnesota, and kind of the darker areas is where you'd be more likely to find balsam fir. This is the same type of map, so basal area map of white spruce, and you can see it's pretty abundant, but a little less so than balsam fir. So our spruce fir forest in Minnesota, we have quite a bit of it, especially in that Arrowhead region, or kind of St. Louis, Lake Cook counties, northern Itasca, and then Koochian County. So in recent years, spruce budworm has got a lot of media attention, especially this past year with its potential role with the wildfires we've been having. So these are just a few screenshots I took of interviews I just did this past year. A lot of these dealing with the devastation we've been seeing from spruce budworm, as well as its potential role with wildfire. And this isn't just an issue in Minnesota. As I mentioned, spruce budworm occurs basically wherever you find abundant amount of balsam fir and white spruce. So the Lake States, the northeast part of the country. Here are a couple of screenshots of articles with spruce budworm in Maine, and they have massive, huge outbreaks there as well. And actually looking at some of the data there, they actually have quite a bit more balsam fir than we do in Minnesota. So it's estimated that we have, for trees above 5 inches DBH, so diameter at 4.5 feet, we have around 200 million stems or trees, and Maine has about 700 million. So this is of great concern for them as well, as they currently don't have an outbreak there, but they're kind of on the precipice of one that might start to pop up in the kind of years to come here. And this definitely isn't a new issue in Minnesota. These are a couple screenshots I took of older articles, handbooks done by the University of Minnesota in regards to spruce budworm and the impact it was having on balsam fir and spruce in Minnesota. So one of those is from 1923, the other from 1940. So kind of the huge outbreaks we've had have been kind of in the past, I'd say 100, 150 years. I'll get into it later in this presentation, but a lot of that is due to just having more balsam fir in the landscape, mostly due to probably fire suppression and then timber harvesting practices. All right, so now getting into some of the biology and how to identify this insect and the damage that it does. So the larvae are going to emerge typically around mid-May, could be anywhere from late April, early May. And they're called a budworm because initially they're going to mine the buds or the old needles slightly before bud break. So this is a photo I took on a spring boundary waters trip I did this year. This was off of Knife Lake, where you can see that very small caterpillar. So these early caterpillars are going to be very small. They have this characteristic black head. And again, you're going to see those probably around mid-May, unless you start, as I did in this photo, if you try to open up those buds and try to find those caterpillars. And so these caterpillars or larvae, they go through different growth stages, which are called instars, and they go through 6 of them. So the photo on the left, that's of the mature caterpillar. So that's about 1 inch in length, and you'd find that around mid-June. It's going to be brownish in color. Sometimes it might have a greenish cast if it still has food in its digestive tract. And then it also has those characteristic spots, kind of a creamy yellow color on the back. And overall, the larvae are going to be present from about mid-May, that could be earlier or later, depending on the year or the temperatures, to about mid-June. So there's a period of roughly, give or take, a month of where they're doing feeding damage. And the majority of the damage that's being done is by the 5th and that final instar. So they're doing a lot of the feeding of the needles. So it's a caterpillar, so they're going to pupate. and that's going to be around late June to early July. And they're going to be in that pupal stage for about 10 to 14 days, and then a moth is going to emerge. So that top left photo is a full pupal case, and then that bottom one there is an empty one. And those empty ones can persist well into the fall, the winter. Sometimes the next growing season, you can still see them attached to trees. And then the moths that emerge, they're present from about late June to late July. Uh, they're only going to live for about 10 to 14 days. You can see in that bottom photo there, they're going to be kind of a grayish brown color, some are reddish brown. And basically they live long enough to, and mates and then lay eggs, and then they'll have a flight period. So they can travel sometimes up to, a few hundred miles if they get caught in updrafts, but they're also just strong flyers themselves, so they do have the ability to spread pretty far, but lots of times they kind of just stay in that localized area. So they lay egg masses from about late June to late July, and here are a few photos of the egg masses. There on the left are the full ones. They kind of look like shingles you would find on a roof, kind of right on top of each other. On average, they have about 20 eggs per egg mass, and those eggs hatch in about 10 to 14 days. And then that bottom right photo is an empty egg mass, and you can typically find those persisting into the fall, the winter, and then again, kind of going into that next growing season. So the caterpillars that emerge from those egg masses are the first instars. Uh, they're going to hatch in the summer, and they typically aren't going to do any feeding damage. They're just going to try to find a spot to overwinter, and they overwinter in what's called a hibernacula. It's kind of like a cocoon-like shelter that they make with their silk webbing. And that first instar you can see is very small. It's about 2 millimeters in length. And once they're in that hibernacula, they're going to molt to that second instar, that growth stage, and they're going to stay in there until the spring. And those hibernacula are very hard to find. They're going to usually be in bark crevices, kind of along the branches. All right, so now moving on to some of the damage these caterpillars do. So lots of times you might not even see those different growth stages, the caterpillars, the moths, or the egg masses, but you'll see the damage that they're doing to balsam fir and spruce trees. So this is some of the defoliation that they cause. So they're kind of messy eaters, messy feeders. So they partially eat the needles. They primarily, as you initially find them in the buds, they're going to eat the new needles. If they do eat all the new needles, they might start to eat the old needles, which is called backfeeding. But you usually find about one caterpillar per shoot, or maybe they might occupy 2 shoots. And then you can see they tie those shoots together with their webbing. You can find a lot of the partially eaten needles get stuck in there, and then they'll turn red. So from a distance, trees can kind of have a scorched appearance. And then you can also see their droppings or their caterpillar poop that also gets stuck in the webbing. So on the left, that's defoliation of a balsam fir, and then on the right, that's a white spruce. So you can see a lot of that feeding damage. It's concentrated on those newer needles. Here's just another photo of that feeding damage. Again, usually you're going to have one caterpillar per shoot. You can see it also where that caterpillar is, kind of to the left of it. It's tied together those needles. And then you can kind of see its feeding station there, full of webbing, that caterpillar frass or droppings. So you're going to find those scattered, severed needles stuck in that webbing. And then zooming out, this is some heavy defoliation, white spruce there on the left, and then a mix of balsam fir and white spruce on the right. That photo on the left I took up by Little Fork. And then that photo on the right, that again is in Tedagooch State Park. So this is kind of strength in numbers. So you need lots of caterpillars to cause this damage. It's estimated at the start of an outbreak, you can have about 2,000 caterpillars per tree. But then at the peak of an outbreak, you can have up to, I've read, I haven't counted, 20,000 larvae per tree. So that's just a massive amount of, caterpillars munching on those needles. This is a good side-by-side shot of showing that feeding preference of balsam fir over white spruce. This was taken up in George Crosby Manitou State Park. You can see that balsam fir is pretty much dead. And then that white spruce, it is getting defoliated, but it still has a decent amount of live needles. Again, just showing that spruce budworm is going to initially feed on balsam fir, and also balsam fir is more vulnerable to that feeding damage. So the patterns of kind of the feeding damage, it's usually top down, more so for balsam fir. So you're going to have what's called top kill. So the moths are usually attracted to those dominant, co-dominant trees, and they're going to lay egg masses initially in the tops of trees. So that's usually where you're going to see mortality first. So that top kill occurs if you have feeding over consecutive years. It's going to be about 2 to 3 years. For white spruce, it's about 3 to 5. But what I've noticed for white spruce, it doesn't always have this top-down pattern. Sometimes it's not very distinctive, can kind of be spread throughout the canopy. And then mortality, if you have consecutive years of heavy defoliation, you're going to have balsam fir mortality in about 3 to 5 years, and then white spruce mortality in about 5 to 7. So during an outbreak, it's estimated 70 to 100% of balsam fir are going to die. And then for white spruce, that might get up anywhere from 40 to 60% of those white spruce. So some of them can survive an outbreak, but obviously this is, if they don't die, a huge stressful event for those trees. And that might make them more susceptible to other issues like root rots. So armillaria root rot, which is a very common root rot issue we have here in Minnesota, as well as they might also get spruce bark beetle attack as well. All right, so now looking at what that impact is having to Minnesota forest, all this defoliation and mortality. This is another shot I took up on my Boundary Waters trip this spring. This is on Boot Lake, where you can kind of see that mix of defoliation and mortality of both balsam fir and white spruce. So for this section, a lot of what I'm going to share is data that's obtained through our aerial survey. So a quick introduction to this aerial survey program that we have here in Minnesota. So we fly most of the forested regions in Minnesota every year, and we have a unit within the DNR resource assessment. They did all the flights in 2024, and they'll most likely do all the flights this year as well. We fly Southeast Minnesota every other year just to get a track of what emerald ash borer is doing down there. And this tool, while it's not, 100% science, we're not going to 100% accurately map, all the damage. It's best at mapping large landscape disturbances like spruce budworm. And so I should point out this map, those green lines that you're seeing are the flight lines. So that's everything we mapped in 2024. And then this map is all of the damage caused by mostly insect damage, disease, and abiotic issues. So these are polygons that are mapped up in the air. And then you can see over in Northeast Minnesota, I'll have a map of this later. All of that is damage from spruce budworm. So this is what damage looks like from the air. So this is current defoliation, primarily balsam fir. It's going to have kind of a brownish, reddish cast from the air. So when we're doing these aerial surveys, we mostly just map current defoliation, but that can be tricky because you're going to have a lot of a mix of what's currently being defoliated and what's dead. And you can also see these forests in northeast Minnesota, they're not continuous forest of balsam fir and white spruce, but they're mixed in with a lot of other species. So one of the main ones is quaking aspen, but you also have paper birch, and then also your red and white pine mixed in there as well, and other species. This is the white spruce plantation. So kind of similar appearance where it has that brownish cast. So that's what that looks like from the air. And then this is mortality, where you can see it has that grayish appearance. And then again, you can see that kind of mosaic of different tree species, a lot of that being quake and aspen. All right, so the impact from 2024. So this map was made with that aerial survey data. And so what we found was there was about 712,000 acres with mostly defoliation and mortality mixed in. So to put that into perspective, that's about the size of 5.5 Mille Lacs lakes, or about the size of the urban areas of Minneapolis and St. Paul combined. And as I mentioned earlier, this isn't 100% accurate. And also when we're making these polygons, as I showed in those previous photos, a lot of this is mixed forest. So that's not 712,000 acres, total of spruce and fir defoliation and mortality, but acres with defoliation. So even though this aerial survey isn't, 100% accurate, it's a great tool for us and gives us a good idea of what's going on here in Minnesota. And we've been doing an aerial survey in Minnesota since the 50s, so about 1954. And this gives us a good idea of how spruce budworm's been operating in Minnesota. And what we mapped last year was the highest amount since 1961. And, you can kind of see that we've had spruce budworm pretty much in Minnesota since 1954, possibly before that. So we're kind of, depends how you define an outbreak, but we're going to map it, it seems, every year somewhere in the state. But you definitely also have these peaks and valleys. So the population kind of goes to a peak and then kind of crashes down. So you could kind of define those years where you have those higher bars as your outbreaks. So looking at kind of some of those outbreak years, what results in those peak outbreak years where you have, when you're getting up to 500 to almost 1 million acres of damage, is when you have lots of mature host, and in particular, if you have lots of mature, over mature balsam fir. And also what's possibly been implicated as contributing to these outbreaks starting to build is warm, dry weather. So looking at that, you can see some of these bars are different colors. So the maroon bar means it was 3 inches below normal of precipitation for the year. The red is 2 inches below normal. That orange is 1 inch below normal. Green is about normal precipitation for that year. The blue is 1 inch above normal, and then dark blue 3 inches above normal. So it more or less kind of follows that pattern. Before an outbreak, you can have a significantly dry year where you're not getting a lot of precipitation, but you do have a mix of years with excess precipitation too. Generally, if you have, again, a lot of mature hosts, that's going to result in that outbreak starting to peak. What results in those outbreaks starting to crash, as you might guess, is when you start to kind of run out of that mature host. So basically, as that spruce budworm has fed upon and killed a lot of those trees, so you're going to have fewer pollen cones, no new foliage grows. So when those larvae come out from overwintering, that's what they're going to look for initially. And if they can't find those, then those outbreaks start to crash. I also have listed there natural enemies. So that could be anything from different parasitoids like parasitic wasp, spiders, birds, they can help contribute to keeping a population at a low level. I'd say they probably don't result in populations crashing, but if spruce budworm is at an endemic or low level, they might help it keep at that low level until they start to build again. All right, looking at some of the aerial survey data again, showing how it has moved throughout Minnesota. So this map shows defoliation that was mapped from 1993 to 2000. So you can see in the legend there, it says 96 to 2000. So we excluded 93 through 95. So during that, before roughly about 96, a lot of the aerial surveys were in the air. These maps were hand drawn. So they weren't kind of these discrete polygons that are now kind of digitized on tablets. So this just kind of makes it easier to look at. But this is roughly the defoliation from 1993 to 2000. So then the green is 93 to 2000. That grayish area is 2001 to 2013. So you can see it kind of moves to that food source, moves to an adjacent area. 2014 to 2019 there in pink. And then this kind of yellow-orange color is where we are now, 2021 to 2024. So that's more or less how it's moved throughout Northeast Minnesota over the past 30 years or so. So it's in one area for about 5 to 10 years, kind of consumes its food source and then moves on. And then it's going to circle back to that initial area about 30 to 40 years later, when you would expect balsam fir starting to get to that mature dominant co-dominant stage. And then this map pretty much shows what I just went through on those previous slides, but kind of breaks it down into more discrete chunks of how it's moved through Northeast Minnesota. And then again, that's kind of return interval is about 30 to 40 years later. So this is where it was previously mapped. So again, kind of are showing that 30 to 40 year return interval. So how spruce budworm operates in Minnesota is a little bit different than how it operates in Maine and some Canadian provinces, where they more or less have boom or bust cycles, where they have, bigger outbreaks than we do here in Minnesota, that last for 10 years, but then the population pretty much goes away. Here in Minnesota, it seems like we always have some consistent population of budworm, but we do have years where it seems to be at more of an outbreak stage. All right, so now looking at what role a lot of these heavily defoliated dead trees might have with wildfire. So the biggest concern is buildup of fuels in these forests. So again, knowing that I was giving this presentation, I took some more photos on my Boundary Waters trip. This again, I think is on Bootleg. This kind of shows that buildup of fuels that's happening. A lot of these are dead balsam fir trees. You have a lot of ladder fuels there that could result in a more devastating fire to kind of run through those fuels. So there's been a lot of different research that has looked at the potential role of fire with spruce budworm damage. One that I reference quite a bit is kind of summarized in this graph. So this study they actually did empirical research. So they actually did control burns, and they found that fire potential is 5 to 8 years after those trees die. And that's mostly due to that production of ladder fuels, percent crown breakage, as you can see in that graph, kind of peaks in that 5 to 10 year period. And that's going to be higher for spring fires. So before green up, you can still have fire potential in summer, but it would be expected to be less because you're going to have more green vegetation. As I mentioned, there's been a lot of different studies. Another one saw that ignition probability increases after about 8 to 10 years of cumulative moderate to severe defoliation. So again, that kind of lines up with that 5 to 8 years after mortality. And this peak is mostly because these dead trees, they're providing drier aerial fuels than live trees. And you're going to have a faster drying out of surface fields occur just because their stands are going to be more open and they're going to be more exposed to the sun and the wind, drying out those fields. Having said that, though, there's still fire potential in these forests, even if they haven't been damaged by spruce budworm. So balsam fir by itself is quite a flammable resource. It's the least fire-resistant conifer in the northeastern United States. That's due to its needles, which are very fire-prone, very dry and resinous. It has shallow root systems, very thin resinous bark, and the branch architecture of balsam fir, it has very low-hanging branches, and that can be a great ladder field by itself. So just looking back at some of the recent fires that occurred here in Minnesota, in particular in Northeast Minnesota. So there was the Greenwood fire in 2021. That was near Isabella, and that was just under 27,000 acres. So if you remember 2021, that was a significantly dry year. And so I made this map just showing where we map spruce budworm, so that outline there is the outline, kind of the perimeter of the Greenwood fire. So going back to 2013, we basically mapped spruce budworm there leading up to that fire. So that kind of fits that timeline of where you would have that fire potential start to peak 5 to 8 years after those trees die. And then just this past spring, we had two pretty big fires. It was the Brimson complex. So that was composed of the Camp House fire, which was just over 12,000 acres. And then the Jenkins Creek fire, which was just over 16,000 acres. So again, here are here are the two fires, the perimeters of those two fires, and then the overlapping spruce budworm defoliation that we mapped from the air. So the Camp House fire is the one there at the bottom, and you can see we mapped quite a bit of spruce budworm defoliation in that area, and then a fair amount in the Jenkins Creek, but less so than that Camp House one. And then going back even further, so this is budworm defoliation from 93 to 2013. 2006 was the Cavity Lake fire, and 2007 was the Ham Lake fire. So there wasn't any spruce budworm defoliation mapped in that area kind of leading up to that fire. It wasn't, I think the late 80s was the last time it was mapped there. But you did have that severe blowdown from that July 4th, 1999 storm. And that definitely facilitated the increased risk of fire there. 2011, the Pagami Creek fire, again, there was no spruce budworm defoliation mapped in that, where, you had trees that would have died 5 to 8 years, where you might have that potential peak. Again, defoliation wasn't mapped there. I think it was around, again, the late 80s, early 90s. So those trees would have probably been way past the peak of fire potential, where they start to decompose. It wouldn't be as flammable. And then, so this is 93 to 2019, as I kind of just laid out. The Greenwood fire, though, was in an area with a lot of budworm defoliation and mortality. The Camp House, and less so Jenkins Creek. And then you can see the other small little red fire perimeter. That was the Munger Shaw fire, where there wasn't any budworm defoliation or mortality leading up to that fire. All right, so now kind of going over different management tactics of how we can kind of tackle this problem here in Minnesota. So just some very general guidance. This is always a go-to answer with forest health issues, but very applicable here with spruce budworm. Just focus on diversifying forest, reducing the amount especially of balsam fir in those forests. It's easier said than done, but any amounts of trying to incorporate different tree species into those forests is going to go a long way the next time budworm might reach a peak. For forest management, we generally recommend reducing rotation age. So rotation age is the rough year that you would go in there and harvest that stand. For economic value, there's different rotation ages, but that's generally the one that's followed. And for spruce fir stands, you would want to do that under 50, probably anywhere from 40 to 45 years of age. To kind of complicate this, a lot of balsam fir, white spruce, the markets are not that great in Minnesota. There's been, in the past decade or so, a few mill closures, which has also complicated things and made it more difficult in management of spruce budworm and these impacted forests. For white spruce plantations, there's been a fair amount of research showing that if you thin them, not during an outbreak, but before, that can increase the vigor of those stands and make them more resilient to spruce budworm. There's not been a lot of research if there's any benefits to thinning balsam fir, but for white spruce, there are kind of some established guidelines that benefits those stands. As I mentioned, just reducing the amount of balsam fir in those spruce fir stands. For stands that have recently died or getting heavily defoliated, you could potentially try to do a salvage harvest. Again, kind of complicated just due to the lack of markets for balsam fir and white spruce. Overall, kind of what we're trying to focus on is building resiliency for future forests. Circling back to that first point, diversifying forests. So, the next time spruce budworm rolls around in an area 30 to 40 years later, those forests, are a little better off to deal with it. We're never going to get rid of spruce budworm. It's a native insect. It's always kind of going to do its thing as long as we have balsam fir and white spruce in Minnesota. But just doing what we can in Northeast Minnesota can go a long ways. And we did get some funding recently in the state to do some of this work focused on site prep, tree planting on some of those damaged forests. If you have any high value yard trees, you could look at applying BTK. So this is soil bacterium, a native soil bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis christaki. You'd probably want to work with an arborist. You could do it yourself, but you would have to, it has to be timed pretty precise when you apply it to trees. You're going to want to target the young caterpillars and roughly when the needles are about half their actual size in the early spring. So we have kind of some management guidelines, some of what I went over on our website. Some of these links are going to be dropped in the chat if you're interested. We also have a spruce budworm management for homeowners guide on our DNR webpage as well for spruce budworm. University of Minnesota Extension just put out a spruce budworm guide for landowners. So this is a good resource that also kind of gives an overview of spruce budworm and goes over management. So for woodland owners that are dealing with spruce budworm, we have foresters in the DNR that work with private landowners, and they can kind of do a walk in your woods with you, go over your goals for your stand. We also have cost share programs that could be focused on budworm damaged stands that could involve site prep, tree planting, cleanup, things of that nature. And then also soil water conservation districts. So different counties, they also have foresters that do similar work as our kind of private land foresters. And they can also, work with grant money and potentially do cleanup projects as well. So they're another great resource that can also kind of do a walk in your woods with you and kind of look at what you're dealing with. And then finally, more help for woodland owners. There's the Minnesota Forestry Association. They also can do woodland stewardship plans. So that's another potential resource in addition to Minnesota DNR, private land foresters, and soil water conservation districts. So one question that might pop up is, why aren't we treating our forests? As I mentioned, there is that soil bacterium, BTK, that can be applied. So why aren't we, aerially spraying our forest with this kind of natural insecticide? So as I showed in those aerial survey maps, this definitely isn't feasible for our current situation. It's too large of an area to treat. The stage of, devastation that we're seeing wouldn't make sense. The value of our spruce and fir forest, as I went over, are pretty low. So economically, it might not make sense. And also, there's a debate, whether this is a tactic that actually works. You might just be prolonging an outbreak as you're, just treating a healthy stand that, is targeting those small caterpillars, but then more moss might go in there as, you have this very healthy foliage. So it might just kind of be building up the population, which is a possible debate. But some of this work is being done, more so in Maine and Canadian provinces. It's called the early intervention strategy. So they do very intensive monitoring. And once they find a population that starts to build up, they'll treat those hotspots early in that outbreak cycle. So where we are in Minnesota is way past that. But that's something they're putting a lot of work and effort into in Maine and different Canadian provinces. So one thing that can be used in management are monitoring surveys. So you can basically kind of monitor for different life stages. One common one are egg mass surveys. So this is something I've done in Minnesota in the past. You're going to target those egg masses. So you'd want to prune off branches where they're laid. So that's going to be kind of the mid upper canopy. And, based on the protocol, you kind of will go through it. And based on how many egg masses you find per branch, per tree, per plot, that can give you an idea of what that defoliation is going to look like for the next year. You can also do larval surveys. So the photo here on the right, we did this last year. So looking at those early larvae in the buds to try to predict what the population was going to be like for that year. That's another one you could do, but you'd probably, if you were going to do management, you would want to do an egg mass survey as you have, more time to prepare for that population. And one that's going to be the best if you're going to do management is targeting the overwintering larvae, so the L2s. So this is northern Maine. As I mentioned, they're doing intensive monitoring. So that's what they look for. So that's a very kind of more of an elaborate process. So they're going to be found in the hibernacula. So the branches that they collect, they have to soak those in a sodium hydroxide solution. So the larvae kind of go out of those hibernacula, and then they have to count these very small larvae. And then based on those numbers, they're going to potentially treat in some of those locations. All right, so just quick wrap up here with some final thoughts. So why we're having this consistent spruce budworm outbreak, as I alluded to earlier, we probably have more balsam fir trees in northeast Minnesota than we did pre-European settlement. The forest ecosystem has changed, and that's probably mostly due through fire suppression and timber harvesting practices. So you would probably have more surface fires that might help reduce that amount of balsam fir and promote more red and white pine. Timber harvesting practices in the past might have, harvested kind of some of those more high value species and left balsam fir in the landscape to mature and leading to potential outbreaks. But fire protection more so, or suppression, has led to a greater population of balsam fir. And it's hard to estimate how much more balsam fir there is now than there was before, European settlement, but it's estimated that we have twice as much spruce fir forest and less red and white pine compared to pre-settlement times. All right, so you might be asking, it's a native insect. Is there anything good with budworm? As I mentioned, it's a native caterpillar moth species. You're only going to have outbreaks when you have mature balsam fir, when that's abundant in the landscape. There doesn't appear to be any link as of yet if climate change is, exacerbating these outbreaks. There's actually been shown that, warmer falls, winters, when those larvae are overwintering can be detrimental. It makes them speed up their metabolism, and then they'll starve to death if there is a warm fall or winter. One thing that's very good with budworm is bird populations. So a couple studies in Ontario, you can see those numbers. Their populations start to skyrocket. Species richness also goes up. Here in Minnesota, there'll be a link in the chat, but the Minnesota National Forest Breeding Bird Program, they kind of highlight a couple species that benefit quite a bit. They refer to these as spruce budworm specialists. So the Cape May warbler, purple finch, their populations tend to go up quite a bit during these spruce budworm outbreak years. And then finally, an outlook for spruce budworm. Currently, we have widespread defoliation and mortality in Northeast Minnesota. Doesn't appear to be slowing down anytime soon. Again, just due to more balsam fir in the landscape. We do have funding available for landowners focused on cleanup planting projects. And as I mentioned, we're doing work here in Minnesota. A lot of it can be complicated. It's a mosaic of ownerships of federal land, state land, county land, private land. But a lot of these different entities, Forest Service, DNR, Nature Conservancy, landowners are doing a lot of great work in hope of, the next time budworm rolls around, we'll be more prepared for the future. All right, so thanks for your time. I'll answer questions with the time we have left. Otherwise, thanks again.
Barry, thanks for that. It was just a ton of good information there, so I really appreciate it. Again, if anybody wants to, the links are in the chat, or in the chat function. So go in there if you want to copy any links out, clip those out of the chat function there. And if you have any questions for Eric, put them in the Q&A section, and we will try to get to some of those. So I think you kind of answered a couple of questions in here already. Richard was one of them that you kind of answered right at the end there. With infestations like the spruce budworm and warmer winters and higher average mean temperatures in Minnesota, do you envision that Minnesota is in store for a larger loss of conifer trees in the future?
Yeah, I know balsam fir, white spruce, they're both predicted, to be kind of climate change termed losers with a warmer climate. Especially white spruce, we're kind of at the southern edge of its range. But that's still, where we actually see impacts from that still might be a long ways out into the future. There's still abundant amount of, balsam fir regeneration in Northeast Minnesota. So I don't anticipate seeing impacts from that anytime soon. I know there are, kind of maps, worst case scenario, 50 to 100 years from now, where Northeast Minnesota might be composed of different species, but, it might be more complicated than that, but kind of hard to predict.
Yeah. Richard also asked about the big news item, the Canadian wildfires are being a lot of smoke down here in Minnesota. How is that related to spruce budworm, or is it not at all? I know a little bit about Canada. A lot of the population is really close to the border of the United States, so there's a lot of forests that their population just isn't there. So it's hard to fight those fires too.
Yeah, that's a good question. I should have looked into that. In some of those provinces currently have huge fires. Some of that might be with spruce budworm. I know just north of us, though, in Ontario, they kind of just started to get outbreaks of spruce budworm. So some of those might not be related to defoliation and mortality. As I mentioned, a lot of those forests that are, composed of balsam fir and spruce are, fire prone. They're meant to have fires too. but yeah, I don't have an answer to that, but that's something I might look into. That's was just mentioned there. But yeah, and as you mentioned, a lot of those are just in kind of wilderness, inaccessible areas that are very challenging to fight those fires.
Yeah. You can stop your presentation if you want, Eric.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Um, Joni asked, is there any correlation between spruce budworm outbreaks and tent caterpillar outbreaks?
Um, Possibly. I haven't looked into that. There definitely might be research out there. Um, you know, both of them, spruce budworm, their populations might do better under with warmer, drier springs. That's kind of similar with forest tent caterpillar. If you have cooler, wetter springs, you might have more, you know, fungal diseases, or you might have more mortality of larvae, especially, if you have very cold temps early in that spring when they're just starting to emerge. Um, but how their populations they're both early season defoliators. Forest tent caterpillar is going to feed on hardwoods, mostly basswood, oak, aspen, and then spruce budworm's going to feed on conifers.
Right. Richard also asked, drone technology is gaining in popularity all the time. Can drone technology aid in some of these surveys that you guys do?
Definitely, yeah. I know our forest health team would love to get some drones. Um, but yeah, that's something we haven't worked with. I know other forest health teams in other states have used them. But the big thing, is dealing with line of sight. Um, for most drone operators, I believe you need to, be able to see the drone. If you're working in, I'd say, if you're working with a private landowner, that definitely might be more feasible to use a drone. But that's our team has talked about, using drones and mapping, and that would definitely give you a finer picture of what's happening. As I mentioned, the aerial survey is more of a coarse tool, but gives us a good idea of what's going on in the landscape.
Yeah. And Julie asked, I think you kind of covered this in the last couple of slides, but is it likely that the huge outbreaks and tree kills are becoming normal for the ecosystem, or is this a more recent problem because of human impacts in the landscape?
Yeah, I'd say as I mentioned, we've always had spruce budworm. The outbreaks are probably been exacerbated the past 150 years or so, again, due to, human intervention, fire suppression, possibly timber harvesting practices. Um, but yeah, it's as I mentioned, it's always going to be here. As long as we have balsam fir in these spruce forests, it's going to have some role, and we're always going to have outbreaks. Just kind of hoping to, you know, minimize the amount of balsam fir, kind of what these forests look like before, European settlement, if that's possible. It's a huge area in northeast Minnesota, so we can't manage all of it. And we can't, introduce fire for obvious reasons with people living there and just the, amount of resources you would need to use for having prescribed fires.
Yeah. Richard's likes the future stuff here. He's talking AI now, AI being used to
Okay.
project future outbreaks. Do you think that AI can provide an additional tool for your work? So,
I'm sure it could. That's something I haven't used a bit. I don't think our team has either, but I wouldn't be surprised if, there is research ongoing looking at, AIs kind of being weaved into all aspects of life now. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's being used to, model spruce budworm outbreaks. I didn't mention in this talk, but there is a lot of modeling work, not necessarily with AI, but predicting outbreaks based on moth dispersal and other things. So a lot of that are useful tools too.
great. Well, again, thank you. We're just about out of time here, so I really want to thank you for joining us today and sharing your knowledge about our forests in northeast Minnesota. Especially, it's a very important area, and a lot of Minnesotans really enjoy going up there and visiting cabin country and the Boundary Waters and everything else. So, um, it's great having this knowledge, and we can answer some questions when people ask the rest of us. So next week, everybody wants to join us for our 221st episode. We're talking about living fossils and modern management, so gar and paddlefish in today's world. So we got the state fair coming up here in a couple of weeks. You can be able to see some gar and paddlefish there, but join us next week, and Devin Oliver will be talking about the ancient fish species in Minnesota. So we're going to get outside, enjoy a lovely weekend, stay safe out there, and take a friend with you. So see you next week.